October 12th, 1944. 6:40 in the morning, a railway siding in Yorkshire, England. The air was cold and damp. Lieutenant Werner Hartmann stepped out of the cattle car. His hands were tied behind his back. He was exhausted, bone-tired. 3 days of travel across the English Channel and through the British countryside had worn him down completely. His uniform was dirty and torn. His boots were caked with mud. He had not eaten a proper meal in days. Around him, 200 German prisoners shuffled into formation. These men were from the 352nd Infantry Division. They had been captured after weeks of brutal fighting in Normandy. Most of them were young. Some were barely 20 years old. Others were older, weathered men who had seen too much war. They were all expecting the worst from their British captors. The propaganda had been very clear about what would happen. The British Empire was built on colonial brutality. They would show no mercy to German prisoners. Expect beatings every day. Expect starvation rations that would leave you weak and dying. Expect forced labor until you dropped dead in the fields. The broadcasts from Berlin had warned them constantly. Better to die fighting with a weapon in your hand than face what the British would do to captured soldiers. Better to take your own life than become a British prisoner. Werner had heard these warnings 1,000 times. Every soldier in the Wehrmacht had heard them. And now, standing on British soil as a defeated prisoner, Werner braced himself for the brutality to begin. But what Werner saw next surprised him completely. Werner looked around carefully for the brutality he had been promised. He expected clubs and whips. He expected guards screaming and hitting prisoners. He expected chaos and violence. Instead, he saw order. British guards stood in neat formations. Their rifles were held properly at their sides. Their uniforms were clean and pressed despite the wet weather. Their boots were polished. No shouting, no chaos, no beatings. Just quiet, professional military discipline. It reminded Werner, uncomfortably, of the German standards he had been trained with years ago, the same standards his shattered division had abandoned during the desperate retreat through France. When your army is collapsing, discipline goes with it. But here, the British victors showed the discipline the German losers had lost. Then a British sergeant approached the group of prisoners. He was middle-aged, probably in his 40s. His face was weathered and lined. His steady gaze suggested he had seen everything war could offer. Battles and death and suffering. And he remained unimpressed by all of it. He walked with confidence. Not arrogance, just the calm authority of a professional soldier. He stopped in front of the prisoners and spoke in accented but understandable German. "You will form orderly lines. You will be searched for weapons. You will then receive water and be transported to the camp. Anyone who causes trouble will be disciplined. Anyone who cooperates will be treated correctly. Is this understood?" The tone was not cruel. It was not kind either. It was simply matter-of-fact. Soldiers addressing soldiers, professionals dealing with a routine situation. Werner found himself nodding before he realized he was taking orders from the enemy. And that is when the first crack appeared in everything he had been told. The search began immediately. British soldiers moved down the line of prisoners. They patted down each man thoroughly, checking pockets, checking boots, checking for hidden weapons or contraband. The search was thorough but not humiliating. They did not strip the prisoners naked. They did not mock them or rough them up. They simply did their job efficiently. Personal items were catalogued and stored in bags. Watches, letters from home, photographs of wives and children. A British corporal wrote down each item carefully and gave each prisoner a receipt, as if these personal belongings would actually be returned someday. Wounded prisoners were separated from the main group for immediate medical attention. Men with bandaged arms and legs, men limping badly, men with visible pain in their faces. British medics guided them gently toward waiting ambulances. Not roughly, not with contempt, just professionally. Then came water, British soldiers moved down the lines with metal canteens. They offered drinks to men who had been their enemies just days earlier, men who had shot at British soldiers in Normandy. Werner was handed a canteen by a young British private. The soldier looked barely 18. He nodded at Werner without speaking. Just a simple human acknowledgement. Werner drank the water. It was cold and clean, the best water he had tasted in weeks. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that his first hour of British captivity contradicted every single warning he had received. No beatings, no starvation, no torture, just professional military procedure executed with calm efficiency. The kind that characterized everything British. What happened next would change everything Werner believed about the war. As trucks arrived to transport them to the camp, Werner overheard two British guards talking quietly in English. He had learned some English in school before the war. He partially understood their conversation. One guard, an older man with grey hair, said something about poor bastards. He was looking at the German prisoners with something that almost looked like sympathy. The other guard, younger, replied firmly, "Jerry or not, they're soldiers. Treat them accordingly." That phrase. Treat them accordingly, not treat them like dirt, not make them suffer. Just treat them accordingly, like soldiers, like human beings under military authority. That phrase would define Werner's next 18 months in British captivity. It would teach him uncomfortable truths about the regime he had fought for, about the lies he had believed, and about the civilization he had been taught to despise as weak and decadent. The British had built an entire system for handling prisoners, and it was more sophisticated than Werner could have imagined. By 1944, Britain held over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners in camps scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. Hundreds of camps. Thousands of guards. An entire administrative system dedicated to managing enemy prisoners. The system operated under clear directives that came from the top levels of British government. Prisoners would be treated according to Geneva Conventions, international laws about how to treat prisoners of war. They would work within legal parameters. They would be fed adequately, housed properly, and disciplined firmly but fairly. No exceptions, no brutality, no revenge. This was not sentiment. It was not kindness. It was calculated policy with multiple clear objectives. First, security. Well-treated prisoners caused fewer problems than abused ones. Happy prisoners did not riot, did not try to escape constantly, did not create chaos that required more guards and more resources to control. Second, intelligence. Cooperative prisoners provided valuable information about German troop movements, about morale back home, about military technology. A prisoner who felt fairly treated might talk. A prisoner who was tortured would die before speaking. Third, diplomacy. Proper treatment ensured reciprocal treatment of British POWs in German camps. If Britain treated German prisoners well, perhaps Germany would treat British prisoners well in return. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, morality. Britain was fighting for civilization against Nazi barbarism. That is what the British told themselves. That is what they believed. And if they abandoned civilized standards in how they treated prisoners, they would lose what they were fighting to preserve. They would become the monsters they were fighting against. But would the guards on the ground actually follow these rules? That was the real question. Policies written in London offices meant nothing if guards in Yorkshire camps ignored them, and these guards had every reason to hate their German prisoners. British guards, many veterans of North Africa, Italy, or France, operated under clear directives. These emphasized maintaining discipline without cruelty. The directives were specific. Do not fraternize with prisoners. Do not abuse prisoners. Maintain professional distance. Enforce rules consistently. Use force only when necessary for security. The cultural expectation was restraint. This was deeply British. Keeping your emotions in check. Maintaining proper standards. Not losing control even when you had every reason to lose control. You demonstrated superiority, not through brutality, but through unshakable composure and adherence to standards. A British officer who beat a prisoner had lost control, and losing control was shameful, undisciplined, un-British. Sergeant Major William Thompson supervised guards at Camp 174 in Lancashire. He had fought in North Africa, seen his friends killed by German artillery, survived battles that gave him nightmares. He had every personal reason to hate the German prisoners under his watch, but he explained the philosophy this way to his men. These men were our enemies. They fought for Hitler, killed our mates, bombed our cities. My brother died in the London Blitz from a German bomb, but they're prisoners now, which means they're our responsibility. We don't abuse them because we're not savages. We maintain order through discipline and fairness. That's the British way. Always has been. We don't need to beat men to show we've beaten them. The barbed wire does that. The fact they're behind it and we're not says everything that needs saying. His men listened. Some agreed immediately. Others struggled with it. How do you treat fairly the men who killed your friends? But Thompson was their commander, and in the British Army, you followed orders. This restrained approach created distinctive camp atmospheres. Guards did not fraternize with prisoners. No friendly conversations, no sharing personal stories. But they showed professional courtesy, a nod of acknowledgement, a fair answer to a reasonable question. Orders were given clearly and enforced consistently. If the rule was lights out at 10 o'clock, it was lights out at 10 o'clock every night. No exceptions, no arbitrary changes. Prisoners knew exactly what was expected. Violations of rules resulted in disciplinary action, typically confinement to barracks, or reduced privileges like no letter writing for a week, but not physical abuse, not beatings, not torture. The contrast with Nazi treatment of prisoners was absolute and intentional. Everyone knew how the Nazis treated prisoners. Soviet prisoners died by the millions from starvation and exposure. Jews were not treated as prisoners at all, but murdered immediately. Even American and British prisoners in German camps faced harsh conditions. Britain was demonstrating that democratic civilization could maintain moral standards even under war's pressures. It was a pointed refutation of Nazi claims that democracies were weak and decadent, that only the strong authoritarian state could win wars. That mercy was weakness. Britain was proving the Nazis wrong with every fairly treated prisoner. And then came the moment that shattered everything the German prisoners believed about their captors. Werner Hartmann's transport arrived at Camp 174 in Lancashire on October 13th. It was late afternoon. The sky was grey and overcast. Typical English weather. The facility held approximately 2,000 prisoners in long wooden barracks. These were surrounded by 2 rows of barbed wire fencing. Guard towers stood at each corner, searchlights mounted on the towers. Nothing luxurious. This was not a hotel, but the barracks were weatherproof, organized in neat rows, clean. The grounds were well maintained. Werner had expected a muddy hellhole. This looked like a military base. Processing began immediately and was highly systematic. First, documentation. A British clerk took down Werner's name, rank, serial number, unit, and date of capture. Everything recorded in neat handwriting in a ledger book. Second, medical examination. A British Army doctor checked each prisoner, looking for diseases, checking wounds, asking about medical conditions. Prisoners with health problems were noted for follow-up care. Third, assignment to barracks. Each prisoner was assigned a bunk in a specific barracks, given a blanket, told where the latrines were, told where to line up for meals. Fourth, explanation of camp rules. A British officer who spoke fluent German explained everything. The daily routine, the work assignments, the disciplinary system, the male privileges. Everything conducted in German by British personnel who had learned the language specifically for this job, or through trained interpreters. The efficiency was impressive and slightly unsettling. Britain had clearly anticipated holding large numbers of German prisoners years in advance, and prepared accordingly. Built the camps, trained the guards, hired interpreters, created the administrative systems. They had planned for victory, and planned for what comes after victory. The first meal was an education that Werner never forgot. Werner expected starvation rations, a piece of moldy bread, watery soup with nothing in it. The propaganda had promised the British would deliberately starve German prisoners, let them waste away, use hunger as a weapon. Instead, dinner that first night was adequate. Not luxurious, but adequate. Bread. Real bread. Not sawdust or filler, just regular bread, stew with actual meat in it. Werner could see chunks of beef, potatoes, carrots, onions, tea, hot tea with milk and sugar available, even margarine for the bread. It was more food than Werner's unit had been receiving during the final weeks of fighting in Normandy, when supply lines collapsed and soldiers went days with almost nothing to eat. Werner sat on his bunk that first night, stomach full for the first time in a month, in a dry barracks with a real roof, wearing the same dirty uniform but with a clean blanket, and he could not understand it. "I could not understand it," Werner recalled decades later in a 1987 interview. His voice still carried bewilderment. "We had been told for years that the British would treat us worse than animals, that they were colonial oppressors who brutalized everyone under their control. That capture meant torture and death. Instead, the first night we received more food than we had seen in weeks. We slept in dry barracks with real beds, actual mattresses, not just boards, and we were not beaten or abused, not even insulted or mocked. The disconnect between what we expected and what we experienced was so profound that some prisoners thought it must be temporary, that this was some kind of trick, that the real brutality would start once we had been softened up, once we relaxed and let our guard down." Werner paused in the interview, looking out the window. It never came. The brutality we were promised never came, and that terrified some prisoners more than brutality would have. The camp rules were posted in German on a board in each barracks, large, clear writing, and explained verbally to every new arrival. Work assignments mandatory unless medically excused. Every able-bodied prisoner would work. No choice in that. Cooperation required. Follow orders. Do not cause trouble. Defiance punished. Break the rules and face consequences. Escape attempts would be prevented. Guards had orders to shoot escaping prisoners. Successful escapees would be hunted down and recaptured. Medical care provided to all. No matter what, sick prisoners would be treated. Religious services permitted, both Protestant and Catholic chaplains available. Letter writing allowed under censorship. Prisoners could write home, but British censors would read every letter first. No fraternization with guards. Keep your distance. Stay professional. Discipline maintained through orderly procedures, not through random violence. The rules were not kind, but they were fair. Applied equally to all prisoners without favoritism or arbitrary cruelty. A Prussian officer and a Bavarian farmer would be treated exactly the same. The rules did not care about your background, only your behavior, and that fairness was something many prisoners had never experienced in the German army. But what about the work? Surely that would be where the brutality showed itself, where the British would work prisoners to death. German prisoners were assigned work details starting their second day in camp, primarily agricultural labor and reconstruction projects. This was legal under Geneva Conventions. Prisoners of war could be required to work, but not in war production, not making weapons or ammunition, only in agriculture, reconstruction, and similar non-military work. And the work was beneficial to Britain's war-strained economy. The assignments were practical and necessary. Harvesting crops before they rotted in the fields, repairing farm buildings damaged by weather and neglect, clearing land for planting, working in forestry, cutting timber. Britain faced severe labor shortages with millions of men in military service. Farmers could not find workers. Crops were going unharvested. Infrastructure was deteriorating. German prisoners of war provided an essential workforce for agriculture and basic construction. Hundreds of thousands of workers where workers were desperately needed. The work was hard, physically demanding labor, but not deliberately cruel. Not punishment work, just necessary work. Prisoners worked 8-hour days, not 12 or 16 hours. 8 hours, like a normal work day. They received additional rations for manual labor, extra bread, extra protein, because you cannot do hard physical work on starvation rations. The British understood this, and they were provided adequate tools and supervision, real shovels and rakes and hoes. Not broken equipment. British farmers or foremen supervised and gave clear instructions. British farmers who supervised prisoner work details were given specific instructions. Get honest work from them, but don't abuse them. Make them work. Do not let them slack off, but do not beat them. Do not overwork them to the point of collapse. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt worked on a farm in Kent for 14 months. He had been a clerk in civilian life, an office worker in Hamburg who had never done farm work before the army. We harvested crops every day during harvest season, potatoes mostly, also apples from the orchards. We repaired fences that had fallen down, helped with livestock, feeding animals and mucking out stables. The work was hard, very hard. I was a clerk before the war, not a farmer. My hands developed blisters and calluses. My back ached constantly those first weeks. But it was not impossible. And the British farmer who supervised us was stern but fair. His name was Mr. Richardson, older man, probably 60. He had run this farm his whole life. He showed us how to do tasks properly, demonstrated the right way to dig or lift or carry, expected competent work, and did not tolerate laziness. If you slacked off, he would call you out immediately. But he also brought us tea during breaks. Morning and afternoon, hot tea with milk and biscuits sometimes. He never raised his hand to anyone, never struck anyone or even threatened to. It was honest work for honest treatment. Hans paused, remembering. One time I collapsed from heat exhaustion during a particularly hot day in August. I just fell over in the potato field. I thought I would be punished for stopping work. Instead, Mr. Richardson carried me into the shade, gave me water, let me rest for an hour, then put me on lighter duty for the rest of the day. He treated me like a human being who had worked too hard, not like a slave who had failed his master. This work program created unexpected interactions between German prisoners and British civilians. Farmers who initially viewed prisoners with hostility and suspicion often developed grudging respect for men who worked diligently and behaved properly, who showed up on time, who did what they were told, who took pride in their work even though they were prisoners. Some prisoners learned English through daily contact with supervisors, picking up phrases, asking questions about vocabulary, practicing during lunch breaks. Occasionally, British civilians would share food or cigarettes. A farmer's wife might bring extra sandwiches. A foreman might offer cigarettes to prisoners who worked especially hard. Small gestures, but gestures that contradicted every piece of German propaganda about British hatred for Germans, about British cruelty and barbarism. If the British were such monsters, why were they sharing their tea and sandwiches? Then there was something even more surprising than fair work conditions: the medical care. Sick and wounded German prisoners received British medical treatment. This was another complete contradiction to everything the propaganda had promised. Camp 174's medical facility was run by British Army doctors and nurses. A small hospital building with 20 beds. Basic but clean and well-equipped. They treated German patients with the same professional standards applied to British soldiers in military hospitals. Not as enemies, not as criminals, as patients with medical problems requiring medical solutions. Wounded prisoners received surgeries when needed, medications from British military supplies, rehabilitation and physical therapy for serious injuries. Sick prisoners got proper diagnosis and treatment. Doctors actually examined them, listened to symptoms, prescribed appropriate medicines. Medical care was competent and non-discriminatory. Werner Hartmann developed pneumonia during his first winter in captivity, January 1945. The barracks were heated but not warm. The English winter was damp and cold. Werner developed a cough that got worse and worse. Eventually, he could barely breathe. Fever climbed dangerously high. The British medical officer, Dr. Patterson, examined him immediately when Werner reported to sick call, listened to his lungs with a stethoscope, took his temperature. "Pneumonia," Dr. Patterson said in German. "Serious. You need medicine and rest." He prescribed sulfur drugs, the best antibiotics available in 1945, ordered bed rest in the camp hospital, extra rations to maintain strength. A British nurse, a woman named Nurse Williams, monitored his recovery, taking his temperature 3 times a day, adjusting treatment as needed, making sure he took his medicine on schedule. She was professional but not unkind. She would ask how he felt, adjust his pillows, bring him extra blankets when he shivered with fever. Within 2 weeks, Werner had recovered fully. The infection cleared, lungs back to normal. "They saved my life," Werner stated matter-of-factly in his interview. "I would have died from pneumonia without proper medicine." This was before penicillin was widely available. Sulfur drugs were valuable. The British gave them to me, an enemy prisoner, gave me antibiotics that were probably in short supply, professional care, and time to recover in a warm hospital bed instead of forcing me to keep working. They did not have to do any of that. I was an enemy prisoner, no value to them except as a farm laborer. They could have let me die, saved the medicine for British soldiers, but they treated illness as a medical problem requiring medical solution, not as an opportunity to let prisoners die from neglect. That professionalism impressed me deeply, more than the food or the fair work assignments. They saved my life when they could have let me die. That says something about civilization that I had not understood before. The medical statistics documented systematic care across the entire British POW system. Prisoners receiving medical treatment from 1944 to 1946 numbered approximately 80,000. Sick prisoners, wounded prisoners, prisoners with chronic conditions, all treated. Surgical procedures performed on prisoners totaled over 5,000. Appendectomies, amputations, hernia repairs, whatever was medically necessary. Mortality from disease was less than 0.3%, less than 1/3 of 1%, lower than the civilian population due to camp sanitation and guaranteed medical access. Medications provided included antibiotics when available, pain relief, anti-malarials for prisoners from tropical regions, vitamins to prevent deficiency diseases. This medical care served British interests, certainly. Healthy prisoners worked more effectively and caused fewer administrative problems. Dead prisoners created paperwork and potential diplomatic issues, but it also demonstrated that Britain valued human life, even when that life belonged to enemy soldiers who had tried to kill British soldiers. Life had value, even enemy life. That was the British position. But what impressed the German prisoners most was not the food or the medical care, or even the fair work conditions. What impressed German prisoners most was something else entirely, something harder to define, but more powerful. The consistent, unshakable British restraint, in circumstances where cruelty would have been completely understandable and morally justified. British guards had personal reasons to hate German prisoners. Many had lost friends and family to German weapons. Brothers killed in France, fathers killed in North Africa, cousins killed in Italy. Some had lived through the London Blitz or other bombing campaigns, watched their neighborhoods burn, pulled dead children from rubble, spent nights in bomb shelters wondering if they would die before morning. They knew what concentration camps contained. Reports were already coming out about the Holocaust, about mass murder on an industrial scale, about atrocities that defied comprehension. These guards had every personal and moral reason to hate the men they were guarding, to see them as complicit in evil, to want revenge. Yet they maintained professional distance and fair treatment. An incident at Camp 174 illustrated this perfectly. When a British guard at Camp 174 struck a German prisoner during an argument in March 1945, the consequences were swift and educational. The prisoner, a former Luftwaffe mechanic, had argued with the guard about work assignments. The argument escalated. Voices were raised, and the guard, a young corporal who had lost his brother in Normandy, lost his temper. He struck the prisoner across the face, not severely, not with a weapon, just an open-handed slap, but it was a violation of regulations. The guard was immediately disciplined by Sergeant Major Thompson, reduced in rank from corporal to private, reassigned to different duties away from prisoners, and formally reprimanded in his service record. The camp commander, Captain Ashford, explained the incident to all assembled prisoners during the next morning formation. That man violated military discipline by losing control. In the British Army, we maintain standards regardless of circumstance. You will be treated correctly, not because you deserve it. Many of you fought for a regime that committed unspeakable atrocities. But because we demand it of ourselves, British soldiers do not abuse prisoners. That is our standard. Any guard who violates it will be punished, just as you will be punished if you violate camp rules. Discipline applies to everyone. The prisoners stood in silence, absorbing this. A British soldier had been punished for striking a German prisoner, punished for losing control, for treating an enemy with less than proper military courtesy. This was a devastating lesson for the German prisoners. This self-discipline, treating prisoners properly because British standards required it rather than because prisoners earned it or deserved it, was psychologically devastating to Nazi propaganda about democratic weakness. Nazi propaganda claimed democracies were soft, weak, decadent, unable to make hard decisions or maintain discipline. But German prisoners could not interpret this consistent fairness as weakness. Not when it was clearly backed by military competence and unshakable authority. The British had defeated the Germans militarily, crushed them in battle. That was not weakness. And now the British were demonstrating moral superiority as well, showing that civilization meant maintaining standards even when no one would blame you for abandoning them. Sergeant Major Thompson described the philosophy to his guards during a training session. These men fought for evil. Yes, absolute evil. They killed our soldiers. Yes, our friends, our brothers. Some of you in this room have personal reasons to hate every Jerry in this camp. I understand that. I share that. But we don't lower ourselves to their level. We demonstrate superiority not through cruelty, but through maintaining civilized standards that they abandoned when they put on German uniforms. When a German prisoner sees British guards treating him fairly, despite having every reason to hate him, despite having every justification for revenge, that teaches him more about civilization's strength than any beating could ever teach. It breaks something in him. The propaganda crumbles. He has to confront the fact that he fought for the wrong side, that he believed lies, that the people he was told to hate are better than the people he was told to love. That is how you defeat Nazism, not just militarily, but morally, ideologically. You show them what civilization actually looks like. And then came Christmas 1944, an event that crystallized everything. December 1944 brought an incident that crystallized the British approach to German prisoners, an incident that Werner would remember for the rest of his life. Camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize Christmas services, both Protestant and Catholic. This was not required by Geneva Conventions, but it was permitted as a gesture of recognizing prisoners' humanity. German prisoners decorated a barracks with improvised ornaments, folded paper, carved wood, whatever they could make from available materials. They gathered hymnals from the camp chaplain. The barracks was transformed as much as possible. It would never be beautiful, but it looked festive, Christmas-like. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, prisoners gathered for Protestant service. About 200 men packed into the barracks, sitting on bunks and standing along the walls. The service was simple. A few prayers, a short sermon delivered by a German prisoner who had been a Lutheran pastor in civilian life, and singing. They sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night in German. 200 male voices singing together. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wacht. The song drifted across the camp in the cold winter air, through the barracks walls, across the grounds, to the guard towers where British soldiers stood watch. British guards standing watch outside stopped talking and listened in silence. Some of them knew the song. Silent Night was sung in Britain too, just in English. Same melody, same message of peace. When the song ended, there was silence for a moment. Then several guards quietly applauded. Just a few claps, a gesture of respect. One sergeant, a man named Sergeant Davies, who had fought through North Africa and Italy, made a decision. He entered the barracks afterward. The German prisoners fell silent, uncertain what was happening. Davies was carrying a box. He distributed cigarettes and biscuits to the prisoners. British military rations, not required by any regulation, not ordered by any officer. Just a gesture of common humanity during the holidays. "Happy Christmas, lads," he said quietly in English. Then repeated in broken German, "Frohe Weihnachten." Some prisoners thanked him in German, some in English. Some just nodded, too moved to speak. Davies left without ceremony, just went back to his duties. Werner Hartmann remembered that moment for the rest of his life. He described it in his 1995 interview 50 years later, and his voice still carried emotion. "We were singing about peace and hope while imprisoned by enemies we had tried to kill, while thousands of miles from home, while our country was being destroyed. The British guards could have mocked us, could have forbidden the service, could have made cruel jokes about Germans praying for peace when they had started the war. Instead, they respected it, listened in silence. And then that sergeant, Davies, I think his name was, came in with cigarettes saying, 'Happy Christmas, lads.' I understood something fundamental had changed in that moment. These were not the barbarians we had been taught to expect. These were civilized men treating defeated enemies with dignity that we had not shown anyone during the entire war. We had killed Jews and Poles and Russians without mercy. We had committed atrocities across Europe, and here were British soldiers who knew what we had done, treating us with basic human decency during Christmas. It broke something in me. The propaganda shell cracked completely. I could not maintain the lies anymore. The Christmas service became emblematic of British camp policy. Maintain security and discipline, absolutely, but recognize prisoners' humanity within those constraints. It was neither cruel nor soft. It was simply decent. Decency as policy. Decency as strategy. But the impact of British POW policy went even further than the camps themselves. It spread back to Germany through letters. German prisoners were allowed to write letters home under a specific system. This created opportunities for propaganda collapse to spread far beyond the camps. Each prisoner could write one letter per month. Sometimes more if behavior was good. The letters had to be written on provided forms. Limited space, maybe 200 words. The letters would be read by British censors before being sent. Anything about military matters or camp security would be crossed out. but personal information about health and treatment was allowed. The letters described adequate food, fair treatment, and humane conditions. I am healthy. I am being treated well. Do not worry about me. This contradicted Nazi broadcasts about Allied brutality toward prisoners. Berlin radio constantly claimed that Allied prisoners were being tortured and starved. But when families in Germany received letters saying their captured relatives were healthy and treated correctly, it undermined remaining faith in Nazi pronouncements. If the government lied about this, what else were they lying about? Werner's letter to his wife in December 1944 was typical. He wrote carefully, knowing censors would read it. "My dear Greta, I'm well and healthy. The British treat us fairly. We work on farms during the day. We eat adequately. We sleep in dry barracks. We are not abused. Everything we were told about British cruelty was propaganda, complete lies. I am safer here than I would be continuing to fight. Do not believe what you hear from Berlin about POW treatment. I am being treated better than I was treated in the Wehrmacht. With love, Werner." His wife Greta was living in bombed-out Hamburg. She shared the letter with neighbors, women whose husbands or sons had also been captured. The information rippled through her community like wildfire. If Nazi propaganda about POW treatment was false, what else were lies? The promises about atomic superweapons that would turn the war around. The promises of miracle victories, the justifications for continuing this hopeless war that was destroying Germany. British authorities understood these letters' strategic value perfectly. Allowing prisoners to write home served multiple intelligence purposes. Censors learned valuable information about German civilian morale and conditions from prisoners' questions and references. Where had bombing been worst? What cities were destroyed? What was food situation like? And psychological warfare objectives. Every letter that contradicted Nazi propaganda undermined German will to continue fighting, undermined faith in the government, made people question everything they had been told. It was brilliant strategy wrapped in basic human decency. And for many prisoners, something even deeper was happening than just letters home. A complete transformation of understanding. Extended captivity in British camps created ideological transformations among many German prisoners. They had time to think, time to compare their treatment with Nazi principles, time to question everything they had believed, and the transformation process was gradual, not sudden. Initial shock at humane treatment gave way to grudging acceptance that the British were not the monsters propaganda had depicted. Maybe they were just soldiers doing their job. Maybe they were not evil. This opened uncomfortable questions. If British propaganda was false, what else was lies? The racial theories about Aryan superiority, the claims about Jewish conspiracy to destroy Germany, the entire ideological foundation of the regime they had fought for. Hans Schmidt described his evolution in the camp during a 1989 interview. "I had time to think without constant propaganda reinforcement for the first time since 1933. No daily rallies, no constant radio broadcasts, no posters everywhere. Just time to sit and think. I saw the British treating us fairly, despite having every reason to hate us. Despite what Germany had done to them, the bombing of London, the killing of their soldiers. They had justification for revenge, but they showed restraint. I talked to other prisoners late at night in the barracks. Whispered conversations, and slowly men started admitting that Nazi ideology was bankrupt, that we had fought for evil, that everything we believed was lies. I read British newspapers that were posted in camp. Heavily censored, yes, but still providing information we had never received in Germany. About concentration camps, about the systematic murder of Jews, about atrocities across Europe. Slowly, painfully, like pulling out shrapnel, I rebuilt my understanding of the world. I had fought for evil, real, absolute evil. I had believed lies my entire adult life, and the British who defeated and imprisoned me were more honorable than the regime I had served. That realization was more painful than any beating could have been. British authorities recognized this transformation potential and acted on it. Eventually, British authorities implemented formal re-education programs in some camps. Classes about democracy, about British history and government, about the crimes of Nazism. But many prisoners, like Hans and Werner, had already abandoned Nazi beliefs simply through experiencing British fairness, contrasted with Nazi brutality. They did not need classes. They had learned through direct experience. Experience is more powerful than propaganda. Then came the ultimate proof that British policy had succeeded. The voluntary stays. When German prisoners began repatriation in 1946 to 1947, the war was over. Germany was defeated and occupied. Prisoners were being sent home, but thousands volunteered to remain in Britain temporarily to continue agricultural work. Voluntarily. They chose to stay. The British government, facing continued labor shortages even after the war ended, permitted prisoner volunteers to stay as civilian workers. Approximately 25,000 German former POWs remained in Britain through 1948, working on farms and in reconstruction projects, living in civilian housing instead of camps, earning wages. They were no longer prisoners, they were workers who had chosen to stay. Hans Schmidt was among them. He explained his decision in his interview. "I had nothing to return to in Germany. Hamburg was rubble. My apartment building was destroyed. My family was scattered or dead. I had no job prospects in a destroyed country. What was I returning to? Starvation. Chaos. Britain offered work, housing, and the possibility of rebuilding a life. Fair wages. Decent treatment. Many of us stayed voluntarily. We had been treated fairly as prisoners. Perhaps we could build futures here as workers. Perhaps there was a life possible here. Some of us ended up staying permanently. Marrying British women, becoming British citizens, building entire lives in the country we had fought against. This voluntary retention demonstrated the complete success of British POW policy. Prisoners treated fairly became willing workers. Men who had fought against Britain with weapons chose to remain and contribute to British recovery with labor. The transformation from enemy soldiers to voluntary workers validated the theory completely. That decent treatment created cooperation, that maintaining civilized standards paid practical dividends beyond moral satisfaction. But why did Britain do this? What was driving this policy at the deepest level? The restrained, fair treatment of German prisoners reflected and reinforced British self-conception about national character and civilized values. Britain saw itself as a bastion of civilization against barbarism, the defender of democracy against tyranny, the protector of civilized values against Nazi brutality. This was Britain's self-image, deeply held. Maintaining civilized standards in POW treatment, even when dealing with enemies who had fought for an explicitly barbaric regime, confirmed this self-image, proved it was not just propaganda, but reality. British fairness to German prisoners demonstrated moral superiority more effectively than cruelty ever could have. This was not naive idealism or weakness. It was a calculating demonstration of civilization's strength. By treating prisoners properly while Germans treated Allied prisoners and everyone else brutally, Britain proved which side represented civilization and which side represented barbarism. Actions proved it. Not words, not propaganda posters, actual treatment of actual prisoners. Captain Robert Ashford, camp commander at Camp 174, articulated this clearly in a 1946 speech to his officers. "Gentlemen, we are fighting to defend civilization against Nazi barbarism. That is not just rhetoric, that is literal truth. If we abandon civilized standards in how we treat prisoners, we have lost what we are fighting to preserve. Our restraint, our fairness, our adherence to rules even when dealing with men who fought for evil. This proves we are right and they are wrong. more clearly than any propaganda broadcast could ever prove it. When a German prisoner is treated fairly by British guards, despite having fought for Hitler, despite having participated in atrocities, he cannot avoid the comparison. We treat him better than his own government ever did. That defeats Nazism more thoroughly than bullets alone ever could. This was about winning more than just the military war. It was about winning the moral war. The British treatment of German POWs represented a strategic victory beyond military defeat of Nazi Germany. Britain demonstrated that civilization could maintain moral standards under war's pressures, that democratic society could fight total war without abandoning civilized values, that victors could treat defeated enemies with dignity. These were not weaknesses, they were strengths. Strengths that authoritarian regimes could never understand or replicate. For German prisoners who experienced this firsthand, the lesson was undeniable and life-changing. Britain had defeated them militarily on the battlefield, crushed the Wehrmacht, destroyed German military power. That was obvious, but Britain had also defeated them morally, shown them what civilization actually meant, demonstrated that democracy was not weakness but strength, proved that maintaining standards even under pressure was possible. The moral defeat was more complete than the military defeat. Sergeant Major Thompson summarized it simply during a post-war interview in 1947. We beat them fair and square on the battlefield, defeated them militarily, then we treated them like soldiers rather than animals. We did not do it because they deserved it. Most had fought for evil, participated in atrocities, supported a murderous regime. We did it because maintaining civilized standards, even toward enemies, proves civilization's strength. That is how you win wars properly, not just militarily but morally. You defeat them on the battlefield. Then you show them what they were really fighting against by treating them better than their own government ever did. You prove that civilization means something, that it is not just propaganda, that British values are real and worth defending. That is how you win completely. And the memory lasted for the rest of their lives. For German veterans who had been British POWs, the memory of fair treatment in circumstances where cruelty would have been completely understandable remained a defining experience of their lives. Werner Hartmann, who lived until 2001, maintained regular contact with British veterans throughout his life. He attended remembrance ceremonies, he corresponded with former guards, he spoke at schools about his experiences. In a 1995 interview marking the 50th anniversary of the war's end, he reflected on what British captivity had taught him. The British could have treated us brutally. They would have been justified. We had fought against them for 5 years, killed their soldiers in battle, bombed their cities from the air, supported a regime that committed atrocities across Europe. They had every moral justification for revenge, every reason to hate us and treat us accordingly. Instead, they treated us with firm fairness. Not kindness exactly, not friendship, but professional, consistent fairness. They maintained discipline, they enforced rules, but they did not abuse us. They treated us like defeated soldiers, not like subhuman criminals. That taught me more about civilization than 12 years of Nazi education ever did, more than all the propaganda and rallies and speeches, because it was real. I lived it. I experienced it directly. That restraint, that adherence to standards even when dealing with enemies who did not deserve such treatment. That was real strength, true strength, not the false strength of brutality and domination that Nazism preached. I learned what democracy and civilization actually mean, not from books or lectures, but from being imprisoned by people who practiced those values, even toward men like me who had fought against them, the British guards who brought us tea, who treated our illnesses, who punished their own men for losing discipline, who allowed us Christmas services and let us home. They defeated Nazism more thoroughly than all the tanks and planes, because they showed us what we had really been fighting against and what we had lost by supporting Hitler. Werner paused, emotions visible even 50 years later. I was imprisoned for 18 months, but those 18 months freed me from 12 years of lies. So what does this all mean? What is the final lesson? The quiet decency of British POW camps tells us something important about civilization and strength and victory. The rain-soaked camps where German prisoners received tea and fair treatment, where guards maintained order through discipline rather than terror, where enemies were treated as defeated soldiers rather than subhuman criminals. These became a testament to civilization's resilience under pressure. Britain proved something vital, that even in total war against an explicitly evil regime, civilized nations could maintain civilized standards. That democracy was not weakness, that restraint was not softness, that maintaining your values when no one would blame you for abandoning them is the truest test of those values. The grey English mornings when German prisoners lined up for adequate food and fair work assignments demonstrated a truth more powerful than any propaganda could convey. That real strength includes restraint. That victory does not require vengeance. That treating enemies with dignity when you have defeated them shows greater civilization than any brutality could ever prove. For the thousands of German prisoners who expected brutality but received fairness, who anticipated starvation but received adequate food, who feared torture but experienced professional treatment, the British camps became their first real encounter with functioning democratic civilization. They learned what democracy meant, not from books, but from experience. And for Britain, the successful management of 400,000 enemy prisoners with minimal mortality and eventual transformation of many into voluntary workers and democracy advocates proved something Britain needed to prove: that civilized values were not weakness, but the foundation of lasting victory. You can win a war militarily and lose it morally. Germany did that. They won battles but lost civilization. Britain won both, won militarily and won morally, defeated the enemy and maintained their own values, proved that democracy could be strong without being brutal. That is the lesson of the POW camps. That is what Werner and Hans and thousands of others learned behind British barbed wire. That civilization, real civilization, means maintaining your standards especially when no one is watching. Especially when you could get away with abandoning them, especially when your enemies do not deserve your restraint. You maintain them anyway, because that is what civilization means, and that is how you win completely.